Before we continue with our discussion, though, let's take a quick look at one of our viewers' questions for this week as well. It comes from John in Polokwane. And John asks, I'm considering going through the debt review process, yet I'm worried that my employer will find out that I'm under debt review. Should I be? I think certainly this is a question for you to pick up on, Paul.
The short answer is no. You do not need to be concerned about the fact. You don't need to disclose it unless there's some interaction or loan from the employer itself. The debt counselling process is a process where it's a personal decision where you actually take yourself through the process. You are listed on the credit bureau, and the listing on the credit bureau is merely to actually prevent you from taking more debt and to prevent credit providers from giving you more debt. And that listing will disappear as soon as you have repaid your debt. So most credit providers, most employers are not concerned about that, and they shouldn't be concerned about that.
Okay, so it's purely a confidential exercise. Yep. Employer knows nothing potentially about what's actually happening Correct. Behind the scenes, and it's really a personal decision. You take it forward. You've decided to take control. You mentioned something during the break, and that was really around the productivity of someone and the type of stress and emotion, because this is not just a financial consideration. It's an emotional and perhaps even psychological one too.
What we see it very, very often is that when somebody approaches you, they've probably left it a little bit too late. When they enter the process, the stress level is sky high. Now they actually say, just give me a plan. Just help me in terms of getting something that I can live with. You give them a budget, you actually restructure that. There's a plan. They say, this is your repayment plan. They go back, and you obviously the big part of it is the counselling part of it, and say, here's the information, this is how we restructure it, here's how you repay it. And what we very often see is that there's a plan in place, they go back to work, their productivity increases, 3, 4, 5 months from now they're getting the promotion or increase and so on, and all of a sudden they're more comfortable in repaying the debt. And very often what happens is that they actually repay the debt well before the planned repayment period. And it's only because there's a plan, stress levels have reduced, they actually can follow a plan.
So now they're getting a certain sense of control over their finances. Yes. and yeah. Potentially a way out that they never yeah. saw before. Peter, I think a question on a lot of people's minds, and we spoke about it, was really around statistics coming out of the Credit Bureau Monitor. Having a look at the consumers in good standing, since the National Credit Act came into force in June 2007, we've seen a slow and steady decrease in consumers who are in good standing. What are those numbers really telling us?
Well, I think there are two things that one could actually raise with regard to the point that you've just raised. One, we've seen, as you've rightly pointed out, we're currently sitting at just over 45%.
So 45% of people are good standing, the other 56 or whatever.
45% of the consumers' records are not good, so to speak. So roughly you'll hear around just over 8 million consumers who are somehow struggling to meet their monthly financial commitments. Now, if you go further on to analyze where does this actually emanate from, a lot of what we are seeing, a lot of these consumers who are experiencing financial difficulties is as a result of credit largely which was granted before the National Credit Act was implemented, typically before June 2007.
So a lot of what we're seeing in those numbers now are perhaps what one could call almost a financial indigestion, really. There was a lot, I know that a lot of the companies and institutions went on a credit sort of providing spree almost before the National Credit Act came to be. I think a lot of people acted on that, and now what we're seeing is that still working itself through the system. You mentioned a little bit earlier that we're seeing less and less people going and trying to access credit, never mind getting granted. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, our Credit Bureau statistics seems to point out that whilst there has been an element of rejection, i.e. in instances where consumers approach credit providers, and we've seen credit providers in some instances actually rejecting such applications primarily because consumers were either experiencing some difficulty or somewhat a bit over-indebted. We've equally seen consumers themselves actually resisting, i.e. not applying for credit. Although I must say, lately we've seen some kind of an improvement, and I think we should welcome that to the extent that consumers can afford to take on such credit, I think, for as long as they take such credit in a responsible manner.
Roland, now you mentioned that people are becoming a little bit more credit savvy after the recession, and it really leads on to what we sort of touched on earlier, emergency funding. All right, now how much typically should somebody have in emergency funding? Because a lot of people don't get into credit purely by a few bad mistakes. It's often disaster that gets them there. Emergency funding, how much and where should I potentially be looking at housing this money?
Well, ideally what we do is we set up a plan for each person. The best thing really for a person is to consider roughly about a 10 to 15% amount per month that they are putting away towards this emergency fund. Now, obviously, when something major goes wrong, you can't necessarily put that amount away. But what happens is that people need to take into consideration that they should be saving that amount of money on a monthly basis as an actual debt repayment. Because if anything does happen, at least they know they've got that emergency in place. Now, ideally what we do is we try and look at options like ETFs or unit trust plans, which effectively allows them access to that money within roughly about 3 to 5 days if something has to go wrong. And normally that's more than enough time to actually allow those funds to be released and actually set up. People sometimes also keep a month or two extra income or extra monthly income in their current accounts. Not a bad idea. The problem though is that you're not earning interest effectively on a current account or a savings account. So ideally by investing that money, you're at least allowing a little bit of growth to come through, which is at least inflation linked, which means that your money is staying real, and obviously in 2, 3, 5 years time, that money is now effectively worth what it should be worth, and it hasn't depreciated in value because of the inflation rates.
But surely, there should be some kind of a target ceiling to say, okay, emergency funding after a couple of years of putting away 15%, as you say,
yes,
we've got to get to a ceiling and say, well, this should be enough as an emergency funding. Let me take a look at the rest of my finances, retirement planning, education, so on and so forth, has to come into it.
We normally say that a good rule of thumb is that you need to have 3 months' salary after tax income into a savings account or a money market account. And that should take care of most of the important issues.
Okay, so a lot of the three months. I've also heard it even go up to 6 months, but I think six might be a bit ambitious for a lot of people. 3 is a good guideline. If we can start aiming in that, that's fantastic.
And then from there, I think it's for people to really start building up an investment perspective over and above that. Obviously, if you keep on saving that money, if you're used to saving that 10 or 15% a month, by continuing to do it and treating it as an actual monthly repayment that you have to make, obviously you're putting yourself in better standing in terms of investment values, in terms of retirement planning. So, and that also allows you to build up a capital amount. Let's say, for example, you take out an endowment plan, which is a 5-year period. After that 5-year term, you now have a capital amount tax-free, which possibly could allow you to now go and pay off a portion of your bond, or allow you to actually splurge a little bit because you've actually saved consistently for those luxuries, like an overseas trip.
Well, like most things, prevention better than cure. Peter, just in closing, National Credit Act, the NCR, debt counselling, etc., is it working?
I think we've made a lot of progress as a country, and certainly as the NCR in terms of implementing the NCA. We are aware of what has been happening internationally in the context of the credit crisis, and perhaps if we didn't have the act, maybe we could have been in a much more worse off position. But I mean, if one takes a macro view where we sit, we've got credit providers properly regulated in excess of just around 3.6 thousand credit providers registered with the NCR. We've got just over 1,600 debt counselors registered with us. We monitor them from time to time, and those rock elements we attempt to take off the system. We've got credit bureaus properly regulated in terms of the Act. If you look at the impact on consumers, as I've said, in excess of 160,000 consumers have already applied for debt counseling. And the question is, where would those people go if we didn't have a mechanism somehow to assist them out of their problematic situations?
So
if you look in terms of the payments,
sorry to interrupt you there. I mean, it really seems that we seem to be on the right track. We've got the debt counsellors in place. We've got the legislation to support it. it's really around the awareness from an individual's point of view, accessing the right information, the right knowledge, and the right wisdom from the right people in a way that hopefully gets them out of debt if they are there, or stay out of it if they're not. Okay. That's all we've got time for, but I'd really like to thank all of you for being here tonight. I certainly think it's given some food for thought for a lot of people, and thank you so much.